Updated the 14th of March 2018, 5:25 Australian Eastern Daylight Time. When Donald Trump sits down with Kim Jong-un, he could make history, but before he does, he will have to reckon with history's harsh lessons. He will be staring into a troubled past, a time when American power was tested. It was a time when the future of the world potentially hinged on the Korean Peninsula, an era of great ideological battle. And he will be reminded of what's been described as a disgrace and military disaster, the longest retreat in American military history. To find a way through, Mr. Trump may well look to a former disgraced president who also shocked the world with an audacious meeting. The problem of North Korea is torn from the pages of the history of the Cold War. Harvard professor of U.S.-Asia Relations Odd Arne Westad has called the war in Korea and its after-effects perhaps the biggest calamities of the Cold War. Mr. Trump would do well to read Westad's new book, The Cold War, A World History. It would be a bracing reminder of a Korean conflict that is complicated, treacherous and unending. It would be a reminder of how things can go terribly, tragically wrong. Westad says the Korean War symbolized the Cold War at its most frightening. It pitted the West, led by the United States, not just against North Korea but the might of communist forces, Russia, China. There were fears of nuclear war and an escalation into World War III, Korean hatred born of Japanese aggression. The Korean War's origins stretch back deeper than the 20th century. It is traced to the end of the Qing Empire in China that kick-started Japanese imperialism. Japan occupied Korea and brutally suppressed Korean identity. Westad points out the Korean resistance split into nationalists and communists. With the fall of Japan and the end of World War II, the two forces were on a collision course, the nationalists in the south backed by the United States, the communists in the north supported by Russia. Deep-seated, inter-Korean hatred joined with the 20th century's great ideological battle, communism versus capitalism, America versus the Soviet Union. Korea was cut in two, divided along the 38th parallel, an area known as the Demilitarized Zone. On one side the Republic of Korea, south the north the Orwellian named Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Each side chose its leader. The United States installed Syngman Rhee, a Korean nationalist who had been in prison for political activities, then educated in America. In the north, the Soviets promoted Kim Il-sung, a 33-year-old soldier who had fought the Japanese with the Chinese Communist Party. Hope remained of a reunification of the two Koreas, with both sides claiming to be the legitimate ruler. After skirmishes along the border, Kim Il-sung struck on June 25, 1950, after winning backing from Moscow. Within days he had seized the southern capital, Seoul. It triggered a war that has never ended. After 3 years an armistice was signed, but more than 3 million Koreans were dead. China under Mao Zedong had intervened to prop up Kim Il-sung's forces, driving the U.S.-led troops back across the 38th parallel, a humiliating retreat. Korean War never ended. That war is still with us. In his recent book, Michael Pembroke, writer, historian and Supreme Court judge, says, the war has not ended. North Korea and the United States remain on alert. Stationed at or near the most dangerous and heavily fortified border in the world, Mr. Pembroke's father fought in the war. He believes it helped lay the foundations of our world. He has called his book Korea, Where the American Century Began. The American century was cemented with triumph in the Cold War. It was hailed as the zenith of Western liberal democracy. American political scientist Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history. The great ideological battles had been fought and won. But Odd Arne Westad reminds us the legacy of the Cold War is still very much with us. Authoritarian regimes remain and draw their legitimacy from the Cold War. China is the biggest example, of course, and North Korea the most dreadful one, but dozens of countries, from Vietnam to Cuba to Morocco and Malaysia, have significant elements of the Cold War built into their systems of government. Westad's book reads like the headlines of today. The U.S. was concerned about the future of China. Russia and America competed for influence in the Middle East. Iran was the biggest concern in the Muslim world for both superpowers. Westad says Asia was central. For the first time in at least 100 years, Asians would be able to determine their own fate. Today, China's Xi Jinping presents himself as a latter-day Mao. Vladimir Putin stokes the fires of Russian nationalism and bemoans the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Iran seeks to dominate the Middle East, and the third generation of the Kim family is in power in North Korea. Today, communism, as it was then, is no longer the specter that haunts the world. It has changed shape and modernized, but Western liberal democracy remains under threat, and by some key measurements it is in retreat. Harvard University professors in government, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in their new book, How Democracies Die, write, the soft guardrails of American democracy have been weakening for decades. Trump, no Eisenhower or Reagan. Odd Arne Westad reminds us there are lessons from the Cold War, there are parallels and unresolved conflicts. Authoritarianism remains and North Korea is more militarily powerful than at any time in its history. What is different is that the West does not have the champions of the past, Truman, Eisenhower through to Reagan and Bush, American presidents, faults and misjudgments notwithstanding, who believed in and prosecuted American values. As Westad writes of the U.S., instead of only acting as an example, it had to intervene to set the world right. The world needed not only American ideas but American power. Donald Trump boasts he will make America great again. However, his critics fear he will abandon the U.S. role as promoter of democracy, that he is no Eisenhower or Reagan. But Mr. Trump may find inspiration from another Cold War president, Richard Nixon. For all his failings, Mr. Nixon was an avowed Cold Warrior. As Westad says, Nixon wanted to fight and win the Cold War. Mr. Nixon was also strategic, and with Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor he decided to reach out to China. Just like Mr. Trump, Mr. Nixon shocked Americans by announcing he would go to Beijing and sit down with Mao Zedong. This was the country America had fought in the Korean War. It was the height of the violent Chinese Cultural Revolution. But there was an opening. Chairman Mao had grown wary and fearful of his old Soviet ally. Mr. Nixon had long believed China should be brought in from the cold and now stressed China should deal with him directly. His trip to China reset politics in the Asia region. It began a process of reopening that today has China as a power to rival the United States and a powerful engine of global economic growth. Odd Arne Westad says the Cold War was about the rise and solidification of U.S. power. It created the world as we know it. But Mr. Nixon's move acknowledged an emerging world beyond American power. He seized the moment. Westad says, Nixon had forced U.S. foreign policy onto a track where it dealt with others on the assumption that U.S. global hegemony would not last forever. Mr. Trump is managing a world where American power is again being challenged. North Korea, a relic of the Cold War, poses a nuclear threat. This could be Mr. Trump's Nixon moment. Matter of Fact with Stan Grant is on the ABC News channel at 9 p.m. Monday to Thursday.